Glory to Ukraine, to the Defense Forces. I'm Fakhrudin Sharafmal, and I'm speaking with legal analyst Andriy Vihirinsky to discuss key topics. Andriy, good to see you. Good morning, Farid. If you believe the media, Biden's visit to this Ramstein should have signaled to Ukraine an extremely strong support, as well as to our friends and partners that the United States remains committed. But yesterday, it was reported that Biden would not be at Ramstein because of the hurricane that is coming to Florida. It should hit almost at any moment. In some areas, it has already started to rampage, and the footage from there is really scary. Accordingly, Biden is not going to Ramstein. Can this be interpreted in any way? Is it worth considering? Because there is already a discussion that if there is no Biden, there is no support. No, don't rush. The end is just a delayed moment. The end does not come so quickly, unfortunately. Look, Biden has clearly demonstrated the priorities in the United States as of today, both in terms of the choice of the algorithm of behavior in general, and we will most likely be able to interpret a similar step from the point of view of how it is read in Ukraine. That is, the priority is domestic politics. Domestic politics in which he will fly, say, to Europe, to Germany, or then to Angola, where he was supposed to fly there. The hurricane, of course, will be devastating, of the 6th category, and there are 5 categories in total. They even want to give it a 6th category, with wind speeds of 150 miles, which is more than 200 kilometers. Florida is being evacuated, and so on. Florida is a Republican state, so the consequences will be devastating.
Відповідним наслідком там місцеві жителі це Такер Карлсон, ну і такий собі DeSantis.
And it's not so much about the destruction of houses, but about infrastructure, lack of electricity, actual lack of water supply, freezing of critical infrastructure for citizens, and a leader abroad.
Фактично водопостачання, ну, завмирання фактично критичної інфраструктури для громадян. І лідер за кордоном.
What does the opponent do? He comes out and says,
А дивіться, поки у нас отут біблійські покарання.
Look, while we have biblical punishments falling on our heads, Biden unconsciously flew to Europe. He is not engaged in the country is in danger, and so on. Well, it is quite clear that the rhetoric will be like that. Although the hurricane is hardly in the realm of events that can be secured by political will or physical presence, it is also clear to us that Biden will not stand like Noah, roughly speaking, and spread his arms to the sea and say, "Go around." Or Gandalf in the first part of The Lord of the Rings says, "You shall not pass." And this universal evil simply collapses against Joseph Rubinetto Biden Jr. standing opposite him. Of course, such images may appear in the form of certain memes on the internet, but nevertheless, we understand that his direct personal involvement or coordinating participation is quite symbolic. But this symbolism, the internal political factors that can influence the elections, are a priority for him. Therefore, the decision lies in the plane of not creating stress for the Democratic candidate Kamala Harris as part of his administration, and not worsening the reputation of the Democrats against the backdrop of images of destruction that will be irreversible after this hurricane. Is the hurricane a higher priority for us Ukrainians than the war? A hurricane is a natural disaster of an extraordinary nature that cannot be avoided in principle. Warfare is a man-made event that can be countered, predicted, and requires certain decisions. The arrival of a hurricane, by contrast, does not depend on the decisions of politicians. But military support, saving human lives through the use of ammunition, this already depends on human decisions. The historic Ramstein summit, for example, was widely publicized
І широко розпіарений, скажімо, історичний саміт Рамштайну, він якраз повинен був...
It was supposed to generate a certain decision regarding our stronger position, which is ultimately connected with entering some kind of negotiation track. Could this decision have been implemented without Biden? I'm sure it will. And today there are reports that, despite Biden's presence or absence, two powerful signals will be announced at the Ramstein meeting. Kim announces that Blinken is not coming. Kamala Harris, of course, could be present, representing the administration, but for some reason I tend to think that she is in a state of active campaigning and will still remain in the United States, holding campaign events in swing states. Maybe Jake Sullivan will come.
І все-таки залишиться в Сполучених Штатах, проводячи в тому числі агітаційні заходи в тих штатах, які коливаються, і не прибуде. Можливо, Джейкоб Салліван приїде.
The presence of Jake Sullivan and the potential postponement of the leaders' meeting diminish the summit's historic significance. If it shifts to a meeting of defense ministers, it loses meaning, as key leaders who can provide guarantees or decide on weapon supplies will not be present.
А буде, відповідно, міністри оборони. Відповідно, зустріч лідерів, яка мала відбутися 10 числа, вона вже, позбавлена сенсу, тому що лідера тої країни, яка може надати чи двосторонні гарантії.
That is, in general, although it is not a very good word, the circumstances that are developing in relation to Ramstein make it not conducive to the implementation of the victory plan and decisive, powerful historical measures related to the victory of Ukraine or reaching a strong negotiating position with the
не таким, який сприяє втіленню в життя плану перемоги і рішучих потужних історичних заходів, пов'язаних із перемогою України.
Russian Federation.
Позицію переговорну з Російською Федерацією.
Or is it the result of a natural disaster, such as a hurricane?
Події природного характеру, яким є ураган?
Perhaps. At the same time, if they had planned to make appropriate historical decisions and realized their urgency for the battlefield and the front, it seems to me that it would not have been postponed. His presence would be important. If you have everything ready, if you really have a solution that has been agreed with your partners on support, status, and so on, and you understand that this is necessary because of Russia's advance, we have problems, so shout. We don't have problems. They are everywhere, and this solution needs to be announced as a victorious one. You would prepare for it as one of the elements of the political campaign for the election. To try to put an end to the war next year without passing it on to the next generation. You did it anyway, because everything is ready, everything is agreed upon, and you are ready for a new, let's say, higher bar, which is raised at the level of the agreed position of the partner countries. So there is no such solution if you can lightly cancel a similar event, not to say ignore, but to disregard the schedules of other leading countries.
Інших країн-лідерів, то якихось надзвичайних чи потужних рішень, які ви можете поставити собі в заслугу, там...
Back then, there were hardly any extraordinary or powerful decisions that you could take credit for. Therefore, everything in this life, in particular, with reference to the war in Ukraine, is connected to the domestic political situation with the U.S. elections. This move also demonstrates that the United States is not ready for escalated military action before early November.
Але якщо вони не готові до початку листопада, тобто до виборів, безпосередньо приймати певні рішення, які стосуються чи...
But if they are not ready by the beginning of November, i.e. before the elections, to make certain decisions that relate to either the geopolitical future of the country or issues related to the supply of arms, then it will depend on who is elected after the elections. I'm not sure whether they will be ready to make decisions in November.
Грає не зовсім на нашу користь. І можливість, чи той козир, який ми сформували в Курську, він теж має...
They, on the other hand, realize that time is not in our favor, and that the opportunity, or the trump card that we formed in Kursk, has certain time and space limits. By delaying important decisions that will allow this trump card, as the American press writes, it should be on the table. If they do, they are deliberately acting in favor of this trump card being leveled. In this context, it seems to me that we can say that the hurricane, although located in North America, in sunny Florida, has reached Ukraine along with other disasters in our country.
Він дістався і до України в тому числі. І я би звернув увагу, що
I would point out that this may be a coincidence, but it doesn't look like a coincidence. Let our viewers think about it, maybe write their own vision of this situation. We had a gap or amplitude of messages yesterday from the President's office and the White House about Ramstein and another event, which was about half an hour. At one point, he comes out and says that there will be no peace in November. And half an hour later, they say that Biden will not come to Ramstein.
Саміту миру не буде. І через півгодини виходять і кажуть, а Байден не прилетить на Рамштайн.
I believe the President's office was informed ahead of the official press release. Knowing that essential decisions for a potential meeting in the Swiss format or consideration of the Zelenskyy peace formula wouldn't be
потенційного наступного засідання в форматі там швейцарському чи по розгляду формули миру Зеленського не будуть прийняті на Рамштайні.
Made at Ramstein, they preemptively addressed questions about the peace summit expectations. Then Biden announced, yes, I will not be there.
А далі вже вийшов Байден і сказав, та, мене не буде.
These events seem unrelated, but in fact, in my deep conviction, they are more than related. If we don't have a meeting by November and don't have decisions that form the background for this summit in November, then the next meeting will be held. No matter how many points are agreed upon, no one can ignore the circumstances of reality in which other platforms exist, including those initiated by China. This isn't a surprise for our presidential office. We'll see if the president visits Germany on the 10th and what signals are sent. However, if the Ramstein meeting is postponed by a week, we shouldn't expect significant decisions like those planned for the 12th. We may just get them on the 17th, and hopefully the hurricane will pass quickly and its aftermath will not force Biden to stay in the United States again. Although the hurricane will last for a few days, it is likely that the consequences will take at least a few months to clean up.
Тривалість урагану буде декілька днів, скоріш за все, і наслідки доведеться розгрібати, декілька місяців, щонайменше. Ось, тому...
That's why I think that everything is obvious here, plus or minus, and we are just postponing Ramstein to some later period. Maybe something will happen there. I told you yesterday that after Ramstein there will be another Ramstein. After all, we have been saying that we will talk about Ramstein more than once. And theoretically, not even twice, maybe even 3 times.
Не один і теоретично навіть не 2, можливо, навіть і не 3 рази. Але, тим не менш, якщо говорити
But nevertheless, if we talk about the elections in the United States, Kamala Harris is now ahead of Donald Trump by actually 3 percentage points. But this indicates that Trump is actually catching up to her, because the gap between them is closing. And I wonder if this is influenced in particular by the events in Israel. Even the same hurricane could theoretically affect this. If Biden stays, Americans will look at him. Look, he stayed in the United States. The war in Ukraine certainly has an impact on this. As for Israel, Trump called on Israel to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. CNN wrote that the United States has not received such guarantees from Israel. That is, the more the fire flares up, let's say in the Middle East, the more I think the Republicans get electoral votes. The situation is actually complex for Donald Trump. The general framework for discrediting or working against his opponent is in the realm of foreign policy and in the realm of military conflicts or the U.S. military presence. He says, look, the shameful withdrawal from Afghanistan is 1, the escalation in the Middle East is 2, and the war Russia has unleashed in Ukraine is 3. Had I been in charge, there would have been no Afghanistan withdrawal, no Middle Eastern escalation, and no war in Europe. A strong leader could have prevented these conflicts. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the front isn't moving in our favor, but towards our interests. In this context, foreign press suggests we need to change our approach to the war and negotiate with Putin.
На фоні цього всього іноземна преса пише про те, що треба міняти концепцію, американська преса, концепцію цілей у війні, а також пробувати йти на переговори.
This aligns the American press, even the liberal outlets, closer to the Republican perspective. In the Middle East, nightly shelling has become mutual and widespread.
І ці обстріли вже взаємні, причому географія.
I believe Damascus was shelled by Israel last night, and in response, some proxies have shelled Israel again. This cycle of mutual attacks could escalate and prompt U.S. intervention. In this context, Trump criticizes the current president as weak, claiming Kamala has stated she won't change the existing position.
І за таких умов Трамп, каже, у нас слабкий президент, а потім на виборчих мітингах каже, а Камала?
In an interview with CNN, I think, she said that she would not change anything about Joseph Biden and the way he conducts politics. That is, in fact, having a chance to go beyond the behavior and diplomacy that the Joseph Biden administration offers, and that a historically high percentage of Americans are dissatisfied with. Kamala Harris says to them, you know what, I totally agree.
І якою незадоволені історично високий відсоток американців, Камала Харріс їм каже, знаєте, а я з усім згоден.
This is a mistake, because in terms of campaigning, the way she has been behaving over the last week, even since the meetings in New York, when she comes out after Joseph Biden and says she sees policies in foreign policy and domestic policy, she is pulling on his negativity. Joseph Biden has a high level of anti-rating or disapproval of his activities.
В тому питанні щодо зовнішньої політики, внутрішньої політики, вона натягує на себе.
At times, approval ratings for his candidacy hovered around 35%, 37%, leading Americans to express shock. However, the candidate reassured them, stating everything was fine. If approached correctly, he could present the same policies under a new guise, using measures and criticisms of his opponent that are highly representative.
Тут виходить кандидат і каже, ви знаєте, та ні, нормально все. І виборець, він, якщо з ним правильно працювати, ще з місяць з ним можна правильно працювати з точки зору республіканців, він каже, так ви виберете...
In foreign policy, the world is burning. But in domestic policy, there is always an opportunity to say, listen, you are planning to change the tax base, you are planning to change this, that, the 5th, the 10th. What did you do since you were part of his administration? Where did you succeed?
А по внутрішній політиці завжди є можливість сказати, слухайте, ви тут плануєте тут змінювати податкову базу, плануєте змінювати те, 5-10, чим ви займалися, цих 3 роки?
In this context, ratings, or rather these polls, are a rather complicated story in terms of the fact that they are measured by votes. Each state has a certain number of voters, but these voters go to a certain candidate depending on how people vote.
Голосами виборщиків. Кожен штат має певну кількість виборщиків. Але ці виборщики відходять певному кандидату в залежності від голосування людей.
That is, if people within a state vote in favor of a Democratic candidate, and there are 10 electoral votes in that state, then those 10 electoral votes go to a particular presidential candidate. Therefore, the gap is not so much in the votes of voters who come to the polls and vote electronically, but in the number of these high-order representative votes that are given to a candidate. And how do you measure sociology in the United States at the level of those who come to the polling station to vote, if these people vote by mail, if they come or do not come in person? There are aspects related to repeated participation in elections, aspects related to going around polling stations. In the U.S., it's all about trust. People think, I know him, he's my neighbor, let him vote. Even if someone comes without documents, they are told, go and vote. In this vein, the electoral vote gap can be determined by 1,000 votes cast within a state. That's why sociology, especially the one that is within the statistical margin of error, does not give us a clear picture of who is actually winning. Anything less than 4% is a statistical error, which in the United States does not give a clear picture. Some people are comfortable calling themselves a representative of a particular political force, while others are uncomfortable. Even the Association of Democratic or Republican Voters is not based on party principle, but on self-identification. You feel like a Democrat today and a Republican tomorrow. You don't have to change your party. Donor statistics are also irrelevant. The number or presence in commercials. If the commercials are effective, they have some effect. If it's just merged budgets, it's a different story. Kamala Harris is losing the effect of novelty, and she lacks a clear position. We are talking about Ukraine. I would not sit down at the negotiating table with Putin alone. But it would sit down, apparently, with Ukraine. Trump also says he sat down and he consulted with Ukraine before doing so. What makes you different in this sense? You say, perhaps, that you are opposing your position to Trump, who says we have to end it all. And you say, no, I will lobby the Congress for a bill for $500 billion so that Ukraine will get it in 1 year. We will throw in all the military equipment we have and achieve a different result. These are opposite positions, in which one can campaign, saying that we will support democracy here and that democracy will win. This is also absent, that is, this kind of gray in the fundamental issues that are on the surface, to some extent, offsets the factor of Kamala Harris's novelty. But these issues are obvious from the point of view of her campaign. And judging by this, the campaign does not have much to work with, because otherwise they would not have allowed her to get involved in such things. Therefore, predicting the American elections is a thankless task. Because what Trump is saying, and what is supported by think tanks that are not connected to value democracy or value beliefs, but to realistic beliefs, sounds pretty harsh. They say, we are bringing our country closer to participating in a war that we should not be involved in. This applies to Russia and our interests in Ukraine. What interests do we have in dragonizing the nuclear threat? Discussions often range from simple to complex, but simple explanations resonate better with voters. They focus on direct interests, as voters are less concerned with the stability of the dollar or international alliances. Instead, they are presented with straightforward messages. About ongoing confrontation and the threat of nuclear strikes, emphasizing the safety of their families. Why are we doing this? That is, you are being asked this question by voters, like, do you want to endanger the life of your grandchild? So, an American, who is not as deeply involved in politics as you and I, and they are definitely not as deeply involved as you and I, sits there and says, oh no, I don't want to. That's it. And the Democrats are telling you from the outside, it's okay, we'll continue with Joe's policy, it's okay. And the election is in shock. So yes, the confrontations, conflicts, and escalations that exist are not in favor of the Democrats because of their position, which has been built by the administration over the past 3.5 years. But we see that the administration, yes, in the part that we talked about at the beginning, behaves in principle the same way. It is not ready to change, not ready to intensify anything. They have shifted, or rather removed, the question of the possibility of stopping the war on the territory of Ukraine for the elections conditionally to the negotiation track as the role of Joseph Biden's peacemaker. That's it. They took it off. If they hadn't, the war would have continued. And Joseph's absence, and as a result, Joseph's absence at Ramstein, suggests that the situation in Ukraine will not change until the U.S. elections. And from Israel's point of view, they realize that Netanyahu, well, now Woodward, is publishing fragments of his interview. Not from the interview, but from the book. He is a journalist who is quite famous. The relationship between Biden and Netanyahu was specific, and the quotes about Joseph Biden's swearing or foul language toward Netanyahu suggest that Netanyahu is probably not in his deck. And Netanyahu is solving his own issues, reducing the risks for the country with regard to the possibility of Arab countries. He uses military methods, knowing that he has the support of the Jewish lobby in the United States. He undoubtedly knows that he has the support of the Republicans and, most importantly, treaty obligations with the United States. Plus, he blames Iran for all his troubles. And Donald Trump has said that it is impossible to negotiate with Iran. It can't help but work, because it's a simple thesis that can be easily put into context, and it doesn't repel consciousness. A sophisticated mind will look at the nuances, at international law, at interconnections, and a simple Philistine mind will say, well, yes, he said that Obama was doing all this wrong, and now he is doing the same thing as Obama's vice president, as president. And his vice president is the next possible president. So they are leading us in the wrong direction. It works because it's linear, and linearity always allows you to relax. You mentioned nuclear weapons, and we still have time to discuss Britain's sanctions on Russia for using chemical weapons in Ukraine. In September, Russia dropped over 250 chemical shells on our defense forces, violating international conventions. However, these sanctions may not be effective since Russia continues to violate such conventions. The UK alone cannot impose sufficiently painful sanctions on Russia. Their effectiveness increases with broader compliance from multiple actors. There is a possibility that EU ambassadors will join the UK in extending sanctions and introducing another package, although this hasn't been officially announced.
В даному контексті, можливо, до Великобританії приєднається посли ЄС,
That is, usually, when we talk about the next 10th or 11th package, we get used to this news in 2 months. What will be there, who will be there, where will it go, and so on. Therefore, without the EU, the economies of the UK and the Russian Federation are not so closely linked that the Russian Federation would feel the consequences of such sanctions. As a symbolism or an example of compliance with international law, yes, the UK has done this. As for the individuals who used military units, their commanders, and the Ministry of Defense, these people on the battlefield are unlikely to fly to London, and the European Union is introducing a mechanism of sanctions against hybrid threats from the Russian Federation, including election interference. Again, what will they affect? In fact, these sanctions, given that if we are talking about interest, will the Russian Federation stop using weapons that contain signs of chemical weapons? No. They won't stop using cluster munitions because there is a war ongoing.
Касетні боєприпаси.
This does not mean they adhere to the Vienna Conventions during wartime. Violations are evident in the treatment of prisoners of war and their detention conditions.
Конвенції під час війни.
No conflict is an exception to this disregard for such conventions.
Умови їх утримання і так далі свідчать про те, що їх не дотримуються.
In the past, I believe, sanctions were also imposed on Bashar al-Assad for the use of chemical weapons. Time passed, and he used them against his own population. Time has passed, even with regard to these weapons, and he is coming out of international diplomatic isolation. We can talk about this in preparing a meeting that may be with the leader of Turkey.
І він виходить з міжнародної дипломатичної ізоляції. Ну, про це можна говорити, підготовку зустрічі, яка...
We'll see when Assad applies for participation in the BRICS again. Maybe he has already, I just missed it somewhere. But nevertheless, I think the geography of his international visits this year has expanded significantly. Not just to the Russian Federation, so it's been introduced. Good. And thank you, as they say. And thank you. Yes, good news.
Ну, запровадили. Добре.
І на тому дякуємо, як то кажуть.
Ну і на тому дякую, да? Це хороші новини.
Thank you very much for the conversation. To our viewers, thank you for staying with us up to this point. We won't be saying goodbye for long, because we'll see you tomorrow morning. So we say to you, see you tomorrow.
До зустрічі.